1962. Just before sunrise, a black Cadillac was found abandoned near the Hudson River. The driver's door was still open. Inside, detectives found a watch, a fedora hat, and a cigarette still burning in the ashtray. But the owner of the car was gone. No witnesses, no body, only silence. By noon, Harlem was already whispering one name, Bumpy Johnson, because 3 nights earlier, an Italian mobster had laughed at him in public. And in Harlem, some mistakes happened only once. 3 nights earlier, some of the most powerful men in New York gathered inside a private restaurant in Upper Manhattan. The whiskey was expensive. The room was quiet. And nobody at that table spoke without thinking first. Because dinners like this weren't about food. They were about power. And that night, every man in the room knew one thing. Bumpy Johnson had arrived. The moment Bumpy Johnson walked into the room, the atmosphere changed. Conversations slowed down. Several men lowered their eyes. Others watched him carefully without saying a word. Bumpy stayed calm. No smile, no emotion, just complete control. Because real power never needed attention, and everyone at that table understood exactly who had just entered the room. At the far end of the table sat a young Italian mobster named Marco Bellini. Young, rich, and far too confident. He had money, connections, and enough protection to believe nobody could touch him. While the older Mafia bosses stayed quiet, Marco enjoyed attention, especially when it came from humiliating other men. That night, he chose the wrong target. At first, it sounded harmless. A small joke, a quick comment aimed at Bumpy Johnson from across the table. A few nervous laughs followed. But most of the men stayed silent, because they understood something Marco Bellini didn't. Bumpy Johnson was not the kind of man you embarrassed in public. And the longer Marco kept smiling, the quieter the room became. Then Marco leaned back in his chair and laughed openly. "Harlem made you think you matter," he said. A few men looked down at their drinks. Others froze completely. But Bumpy Johnson didn't react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply looked at Marco with a kind of calm that made people uncomfortable. Bumpy slowly folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. His face stayed completely still. No anger, no emotion. That silence felt heavier than shouting. Several men at the table stopped eating. Even Marco's smile faded for a second. Because, deep down, every man in that room suddenly realized the same thing. Something had gone very wrong. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere never recovered. Nobody laughed anymore. The smoke hanging above the table suddenly felt heavier. Men exchanged nervous looks without speaking. Marco tried acting confident, but the room had already changed. Because fear spreads quietly. And that night, everyone at that table could feel it growing. When the dinner finally ended, Bumpy Johnson stood up calmly and adjusted his jacket. The entire table watched him in silence. Before leaving, he looked directly at Marco Bellini. Then he spoke softly. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." That was all he said. No threats, no anger, but somehow, those 6 words felt colder than violence. Later that night, Marco Bellini walked through Manhattan, laughing beside his black Cadillac. He still believed the dinner meant nothing. Still believed nobody would dare touch him. Rain covered the streets. A dark sedan waited quietly in the distance. Marco never noticed it, because arrogant men rarely see danger until it's already too close. The next morning, police discovered Marco Bellini's Cadillac near the river. The driver's door was open. His watch remained inside the car. So did his hat. But Marco himself had vanished completely. No struggle. No witnesses. Nothing. The city immediately understood what that meant. And suddenly, nobody in New York wanted to say Bumpy Johnson's name too loudly. By afternoon, Harlem was already full of rumors. Men outside barbershops whispered quietly on street corners. Nobody claimed to know the truth, but nobody sounded surprised either. Because Harlem had its own rules, and disrespect carried consequences, especially when it involved Bumpy Johnson. The strange part wasn't that Marco disappeared. The strange part was how quickly everyone accepted it. Inside a private back room, several Italian mafia bosses gathered in silence. One chair at the table remained empty, Marco Bellini's chair. Nobody touched the whiskey in front of it. Nobody joked anymore. Because this was no longer about disrespect. It was about fear. And for the first time in years, powerful men in New York were beginning to fear Bumpy Johnson again. Bumpy Johnson never explained what happened. He never denied anything either. He simply continued walking through Harlem like always. Calm, silent, untouchable. And somehow, that silence made the story even more dangerous. Because people fear what they cannot prove. And over time, the disappearance of Marco Bellini stopped feeling like a crime. It became a warning. A few nights later, an old man stood beneath a Harlem streetlight, speaking quietly to a group of younger men. Then he looked toward the dark street and smiled slightly. "Some men disappear twice," he said. "Once from the streets, and once from memory." After that, nobody spoke, because deep down, everyone already knew exactly who he was talking about.